Let's start with the document itself because the document is the whole story. When Washington and Tehran put their names on the Islamabad Memorandum, the headlines called it a peace deal, a ceasefire, an off-ramp from a war that had dragged on for months. Read it line by line and it looks like something else entirely. It looks like the terms a losing side accepts when it's run out of better options. Not because Iran forced Washington to its knees militarily, nobody serious argues that, but because of a much duller, much less cinematic problem. Fuel. Specifically the kind of fuel that keeps trucks moving and planes flying, and the fact that the United States was staring down the calendar on exactly how much of it was left. Go back to the moment the administration signed. The public justification, more or less stated outright, was that the country had roughly 4 weeks of a certain kind of oil supply remaining. That's a strange thing for the most powerful military and economic power on the planet to admit. And it's worth sitting with why that admission happened because it tells you something the celebratory press conferences didn't. Not all crude oil is interchangeable. There's a version of it heavy and high in sulfur, often called sour crude, that the Persian Gulf has historically supplied to the world in large volume, something in the neighborhood of a fifth of global output. There's a lighter, sweeter version, the kind North America produces domestically, that behaves completely differently once it hits a refinery. This isn't a minor technical footnote, it's the whole ballgame. American refineries on the Gulf Coast were built over decades specifically to process the heavy stuff. You can't just swap in the light, sweet oil and expect the same output because the machinery itself is calibrated differently. Think of it the way you'd think of a diesel engine and a gasoline engine sitting side by side. They're both engines. They both burn fuel, but you cannot pour one fuel into the other vehicle and expect it to run. You'll damage the whole system trying. Refineries have that same rigidity built into their design. So when the Gulf effectively got shut off as a shipping route in the early days of the war, it didn't cause an immediate crisis because there were tankers already at sea, already loaded, still steaming toward American ports. Those ships kept arriving for roughly another month and a half. And it's not a coincidence, if you track the calendar, that the push for a ceasefire intensified right around the time those last cargoes were finally offloaded. Once that buffer ran out, there was no more pretending. Here's the part that doesn't get repeated enough. The heavy sour crude isn't used to make just anything. About a third of a barrel of that oil becomes what refiners call the middle distillates, the fraction that turns into diesel and aviation fuel, not gasoline for your car. Diesel for trucks, tractors, freight trains, and the jet fuel that keeps the Air Force and every airline in the sky. That is the specific narrow category of fuel that was put at risk. And that narrow category happens to be the one that determines whether food gets to grocery stores and whether a military can sustain any kind of extended air campaign. The government's answer in the interim was to draw down the strategic reserve, pulling barrels out of storage at a rate of roughly 1.5 million a day. Do the arithmetic on how many barrels were sitting in that reserve against that daily draw rate, and you get a countdown clock, a window of about 120 days. Count forward from when that drawdown started, and you land, conveniently or not, right around the second week of July, which is to say right now as this is being recorded. That reserve was never a fix. It was a way to paper over the gap long enough to negotiate, and it's about to run out at almost the exact moment the 4-week warning Trump gave lines up with when the real shortfall was always going to bite. Meanwhile, the oil that has started flowing back out of the Gulf since the agreement, and it's a fraction of what used to flow, somewhere around a fifth of the prior volume, isn't going to American ports anyway. It's going east, China, India, Japan, South Korea. Which means the deal that was sold domestically as the thing that would fix the fuel problem hasn't actually fixed the fuel problem for the country that signed it. It fixed a diplomatic problem. The energy problem is still sitting there quietly waiting for the reserve to hit zero. And even if a tanker left the Gulf today, right now, bound for the United States, that's a voyage measured in weeks, over a month, realistically before a single barrel reaches an American refinery. There is no version of this where the shortfall gets patched quickly. The financial markets, for what it's worth, don't appear to have priced any of this in yet, which usually means one of two things. Either the concern is overstated, or the correction is still coming, and it's going to look sudden when it arrives. Now to the text of the agreement itself, because the fine print matters more than the framing. There's a specific clause dealing with the Strait of Hormuz, and the wording is unusually precise for a document that is vague almost everywhere else. It states that upon signing, Iran will use its best efforts to ensure safe passage for commercial vessels without charge for 60 days. Read that again. It names one party responsible for arranging safe passage through that strait. Not a coalition, not a neutral maritime authority, not any of the other Gulf states, just Iran. Which means whether Washington likes the implication or not, that the same clause hands the practical authority over who moves through that waterway and under what terms, the moment the 60-day free window closes. Nothing in the text prohibits tolls after that point. Nothing at all. Iran gave up nothing by agreeing not to charge fees for 2 months. It's already signaling that tolls are coming once that clock runs out. And there's no provision anyone can point to that says they can't. There's also a provision on Lebanon respecting the country's sovereignty and territorial integrity that appears to have been treated as optional almost immediately. Instead, arrangements were brokered that allowed foreign military forces to remain positioned inside Lebanese territory, negotiated through a president who represents a minority faction of a country where the majority of the population isn't part of that faction at all. If you're looking for the clause Iran could point to first should it decide the agreement isn't being honored, that's probably it. And then there's the part where a country attacked a commercial vessel attempting to transit the strait without securing permission. And the American response was to strike back militarily, even though nothing in the agreement gives Washington the authority to punish Iran for enforcing exactly the passage authority, the agreement itself assigned to Iran. The first line of the memorandum states plainly that neither side will attack the other. If a party wanted an exception carved out for exactly this scenario, that exception needed to be written down. It wasn't. So, whichever side is technically in breach here is at minimum a live argument, not a settled one. And it's not obviously the side getting blamed in most of the coverage. What's striking is how the two governments seem to be handling this so differently in public versus in practice. Publicly, there's still tough talk, strong statements, claims of decisive action, the language of a country that dealt with a problem firmly. Quietly, the picture looks almost the opposite. Reports have circulated of an order to begin withdrawing forces that had been deployed to the Gulf for the war effort. Bomber deployments that had been stationed in the UK for potential action against Iran reportedly relocated out. Fighter squadrons that had been based in Jordan reportedly moved north as well. None of that looks like a posture of imminent re-engagement. It looks like a drawdown being managed quietly enough that the public messaging doesn't have to catch up to it. There's also a detail worth flagging about how militaries actually organize for sustained crisis response because it's more revealing than any press release. In the run-up to and during active fighting, the command structure reportedly stood up around-the-clock crisis teams staffed continuously 7 days a week, monitoring the theater in real time. Around the time the memorandum was signed, that round-the-sea lock rotation reportedly scaled back to a standard business hours schedule. That's not a cosmetic change. An organization that genuinely expects to resume major combat operations on short notice does not downgrade its own monitoring posture to a 9-to-5 rhythm. You maintain the continuous watch specifically because crises don't wait for business hours. Scaling it back is itself a signal, maybe a more honest one than anything said at a podium. If that reading holds that the United States has in practice stood down rather than escalated, the natural next question is what that does to the regional balance. And the honest answer is that it strengthens Iran's position. Not because Iran won some decisive battlefield victory, but because the country that was supposed to leave Iran diminished has instead ended up with more leverage than it had before the war started. That has consequences well beyond Iran's own borders. Gulf states that spent years hedging against Iranian influence now have to recalibrate around a stronger, not weaker Iran sitting on the strait that a fifth of the world's seaborne oil trade depends on. Israel's position in all this deserves its own honest look separate from the diplomatic noise. There's a meaningful difference between what a country wants to do and what it's actually capable of sustaining. Domestic polling in Israel itself, by some accounts, showed a striking number of people believing Iran had come out ahead in the exchange, which is not a small thing for a population to conclude about its own government's military campaign. There have also been pointed public statements from Israeli officials making clear they don't feel bound by whatever restraint Washington wants to project, alongside a story alleging that American officials warned Iran that Israel might target its negotiators. A warning that, if accurate, would suggest genuine daylight between Washington and Jerusalem on where this should go next, not simply coordinated messaging. Underneath the rhetoric sits a fairly stark operational reality. Sustained air campaigns depend on things that are unglamorous and absolutely essential: aerial refueling capacity, capacity, a steady supply of aviation fuel, defensive systems that can reliably intercept incoming fire. On that last point, independent reviews of footage from the ballistic missile exchanges during the war have suggested that even sophisticated air defense systems deployed at scale intercepted a relatively small share of what was fired at them, reportedly under 10% effectiveness in some assessments. If that holds up, it means a renewed exchange wouldn't look like a contained surgical strike followed by a quiet return to normal. It would look like a country absorbing serious damage to exactly the infrastructure, airfields, fuel depots it would need intact to keep fighting. Twice already, reported accounts suggest Israel pushed for a ceasefire specifically because the cost of continuing had become too high. That's not the profile of a side holding all the cards. Step back from Iran for a moment because there's a second front worth putting next to this one, and it rhymes in an uncomfortable way. Reports have surfaced, sourced to intelligence assessments shared with the press, suggesting Russia may be weighing a strike on Poland specifically to gauge how NATO would respond. It's worth being skeptical of that framing on its face. If the goal were restoring deterrence after a string of provocations, there are more plausible targets. A state more directly implicated in recent attacks, a government whose own officials have been caught on tape admitting to facilitating drone strikes into Russian territory. Poland at this exact moment is an odd choice because Poland and Ukraine are in the middle of the sharpest rupture in their wartime relationship yet. That rupture deserves real attention because it's being flattened in most Western coverage into a vague historical dispute which badly undersells what's actually happening. For years, Polish volunteers made up the largest foreign contingent fighting alongside Ukraine. Tens of thousands of them by some estimates, with well over 10,000 reported dead. That's not a small symbolic contribution. That's blood in large quantities from a country that mostly stayed quiet about a very old wound. That wound is the mass killing of well over 100,000 Polish civilians during the Second World War, carried out by nationalist militias that modern Ukrainian institutions have in various forms elevated to hero status, parades, monuments, official commemorations. Poland's government has now said publicly and without much ambiguity that European Union membership isn't happening for Ukraine until that history gets confronted honestly rather than celebrated. That is a genuinely large shift, and it's happening from a government that spent over a decade treating any mention of Ukrainian nationalist collaboration with Nazi Germany as Russian disinformation. The convenient timing of a leaked story about an imminent Russian strike on exactly this country at exactly this moment is worth noticing rather than accepting uncritically. It reads at minimum like an attempt to paper over a genuine rift with a fresh external threat. None of that means the broader danger isn't real. The pattern of escalation between Russia and NATO members has been getting less deniable by the month. Reported strikes on targets frequented by Westerners, naval standoffs in the Baltic where a warship reportedly forced a patrol boat to back down. Open discussion from voices close to the Kremlin about what it would take to restore deterrence with Europe. Some of that discussion has reportedly extended to the idea that a conventional missile response might not be sufficient and that a tactical nuclear signal could eventually be on the table if the strikes on Russian territory keep coming from weapons and drones built and supplied by NATO countries. Add to that plans from states like Finland and Lithuania to host nuclear weapons closer to the Russian border, and you have a set of trend lines that all point the same direction, even if the exact trigger and the exact timing remain genuinely unknowable. There's a historical echo worth pointing to here because it's happened before in a way that maps closely onto what's unfolding now. In the lead-up to Russia's initial invasion of Ukraine, a senior French official later suggested that Moscow had come to believe it faced a binary choice: strike first or eventually be struck, and acted a few months after reaching that conclusion. If a similar calculation is forming again, the logic wouldn't be about restoring pride or making a point. It would be about not wanting to wait for an opponent that has openly declared its intention to rearm on a longer timeline, say by the end of the decade, and deciding it's better to move while the gap still favors you than to wait until it doesn't. Bring it back to the fuel question, because that's the piece with a genuine trackable deadline attached to it, unlike almost everything else in this conversation. Watch what happens to diesel and aviation fuel pricing and availability over the coming weeks, because that's where the theory gets tested against reality. If the strategic reserve really is running dry right around now, and the replacement flow from the Gulf really is being diverted almost entirely toward Asian markets, then the constraint on what the United States can do militarily in the near term isn't political will. It's physics and and logistics. A government that can't reliably fuel a sustained air campaign doesn't get to run one, regardless of what gets said in a press briefing. That likely holds through the summer at minimum. Once the political calendar shifts toward the fall and midterm elections start weighing more heavily on every decision in Washington, the appetite for reopening a war that risks American casualties gets even smaller, not bigger. Whatever comes next in this region and in Eastern Europe, the timeline that actually matters may have less to do with declarations of resolve and far more to do with barrels in a reserve tank slowly running toward zero.